welcome to my channel. Today we'll be looking at a very critical subject in cybersecurity, which is regulatory compliance, and then I'll be using Qualys to demonstrate how you can be compliant within your organization with the regulatory standards that applies to your business. Okay, so who am I? My name is Oluwaseyi Akilude. I'm from Nigeria. I've been in cybersecurity now for the past 8 years and still counting. I've been opportunity to work in telecommunication industry, in the consulting space, and also in the educational services. At the moment, I work with a consulting firm, and also in the course of my career, I've been able to acquire the following certifications: ISC Square, with ISC Square, with SANS, with Qualys, with Fortinet, and the likes. I'm also a certified technical trainer, which allows me to do the things that I'm doing, providing this knowledge to organizations and individuals alike. For family, I'm married and then I'm blessed with two beautiful kids. All right, so you can actually reach me on my social media handle. You can reach me on LinkedIn, you can reach me via email, and then you can reach me on this channel. You can just drop me a message and then I'll definitely get back to you. All right, so what's going to be our learning objective for today's um, teaching? So, one of the things we'll be looking at: what does it mean to be compliant? What exactly are Qualys product? What products portfolio does Qualys offer to achieve regulatory compliance within your organization? And then within that portfolio, what are the components put together to ensure that you can achieve that you can use those products to achieve policy compliance or regulatory standard compliance within your organization. And then finally, I'm going to round up with a demo to show you how you can use the Qualys products to achieve regulatory standards, regulatory compliance, within your organization. Okay, so what exactly does it mean to be compliant? To be compliant or compliance it simply means adhering to security regulations provided by regulatory bodies, frameworks, or laws to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. So what exactly does that mean? So what it means is that regulatory bodies, they create requirements that each organization must meet for them to handle data appropriately. So in terms of ensuring that the data are confidential, um, providing integrity and availability, which is the CIA triad as regards information security and cyber security. So those regulatory bodies tend to provide those standards that organizations are they adhere to, and then they can ensure that they meet the goal of each of those regulatory bodies. And once you don't meet up with these regulatory bodies security requirements, then you're liable to sanctions. So those sanctions could be revocation of license depending on the regulatory body they're trying to be compliant with, or it could be monetary in terms of finance, paying certain fines and all that. So I decided to use this pyramid approach to create a pictorial view as to a proper overview as to compliance and how it applies to organizations and all that. So regulatory body, for example, so let's take regulatory body, regulatory bodies and demystify it. So for regulatory bodies, so let's take ISO, International Standard for Organization, which is referred to as ISO as an example, which is a regulatory body, and they provide different standards. So some of the standards are in the 27,000 series, which is for information security management system. So what does that mean? So they provide, so in those standards provide security requirements which an organization must adhere to ensure the corporate goal, which is the CIA tribe that I spoke about. And then in those standards offer controls to meet, which are requirements as to how to mitigate or to respond to specific requirement that they've actually provided. So in that space, that's basically how compliance actually came into being. Then also for laws, different countries have different laws as regards cyber security. So for example, privacy laws, which could be in the form of GDPR, or it could be POPI. So each country definitely have a privacy law that they must that organizations that deals with personal identifiable information must be compliant with. Therefore, frameworks are just documentations, the policies and procedures around the implementation and ongoing management of information security control. So, an example of a framework is NIST, a NIST cybersecurity framework, which provides you with five different functions, which is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So I'm not going to dive into each of those framework, but I just wanted to give an overview as to how that works. So like I said, so the second layer is the standard. So the regulatory bodies or the laws or the frameworks, they create standards. So those standards are what the organization should comply with. So for example, so the PCI DSS, for example, is the payment card industry standard that applies to payment cards to businesses that transact based that do transaction with cards, for example, so the MasterCard, the Visa and things like that. So, or you're a business that do transaction within that space. So then that means that as an organization you need to be compliant with the PCI DSS standards, and if you don't, then definitely your license will be revoked from you doing that kind of a business, because the goal is to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. So in that space, it brings us to policies. So if you look at this diagram as well, you see that I have external at the top. The first two layers is external. The last two layers is internal. So the external part means that the regulatory bodies and the standards, they are external to your organization, meaning that you don't have control over those standards. You can't say, no, I don't want this part in it. I don't want this standard, or I don't want to comply with this, or I don't want to be involved with this standard. You definitely don't have control as to how the standards are created and things like so. That means it's external to your organization. So the internal part is that, so once you know, okay, as an organization we have to be compliant with ISO 27001, for example, then you have to put policies within your organization that would align with those standards. So for policies are of three types. There's this system-based policy, that issue-specific policies, and then there's a program-based policy. So for program-based policy, for example, let's say you have your vulnerability management program in your organization, then you should have a policy that speaks to that particular program, or you have a security awareness program in your organization, then you should have a policy that speaks to that particular program. So that program would speak to roles and responsibilities. The policy will speak to roles and responsibilities, and also the way and manner by which you want to implement that particular program. Then for issue specific, those are tied to specific issues. For example, bring your own device, type of specific type of policy, or policy like an acceptable use policy. Those are policies that speak to specific issues within your organization. Then system-based are more of technology-based policies, like your firewall policy, or your system policies that has to do with endpoints and all that. So endpoints type of policies, or policies that are technology oriented, so to speak. So those policies are internal to your organization. So, and you're creating those policies to be tailored, towards a particular standard. And then each of those standards usually have controls as well. So they create you with requirements, and then they create controls that you must have within your organization. So now each of those controls, the regulatory body don't provide you with technologies you use to implement those particular controls, but they provide you with a guideline that says, for this particular segment, like asset management, for example, they give you a control that says you must have a solution that can provide you a solution that allows you to, or they tell you that in your asset management you must be able to have a detailed you must be able to have detailed information about your asset. So most organizations, in implementing those controls, then technology come into play. So in those technologies, people use different tools to implement different asset control. Using asset management, for example. So different organizations use different technologies to implement such control. So for the regulatory bodies, they don't tell you use this particular technology. Just expect that in your organization you should have a technology or an approach as a control to ensure that you're meeting up with that particular security requirement. So which is actually internal to your organization. Any technology of your choice, it's up to you based on your budget and also knowledge base of your staffs to on how they can actually use this technology you're trying to use to implement a particular control. And so this also brings auditors into play. So in when it comes to auditing, there are two types of audits. There is internal audit and then there's external audit. And then for the external audit is you bringing an external entity into your organization to ensure that you are compliant with regulatory standards. And then when you have internal auditors, the internal auditors take the standards and then ensure that internally you are actually compliant with those standards before the external entity usually come into play. So that's a pretty much a broader overview as to what's compliance, what it means to be compliant. And then I made a note here that says compliance with standard is industry based. So what does that mean? It means that if I'm in the PCI, if I'm in the payments industry, then I should be compliant to the PCI DSS standards. If I'm in information system, if I deal with information systems, then I need to be compliant with the ISO 27001. So each industry have a regulatory body that you should be compliant with. Okay, so I just wanted to provide that broader overview as to compliance, as to what compliance actually is. All right. So how does Qualys what part does Qualys play as we, in this whole compliance conversation? So Qualys offer three products that helps organization to achieve compliance. So first is the policy compliance subscription license. The second is the PCI compliance, and the third is the security assessment questionnaire. So for the policy compliance subscription offers you opportunity to be able to be compliant with different regulatory bodies, with the NIST, with different regulatory bodies using their own policy library. So they have over 20,000 policy libraries that you can actually use Qualys to achieve this compliance with. Then also they have the PCI compliance, which is solely tied to as you being PCI compliant. So they've already mapped the PCI compliance requirements, and then you could just run with the libraries to run with on your asset to ensure that your assets they are actually compliant with the PCI DSS standards. And then the security assessment questionnaire provides you with an opportunity to be able to create a questionnaire for security assessment within your organization. So in this video, I'll be focusing primarily on the policy compliance. So we're going to use policy compliance subscription to create policies to ensure that our assets are policy compliant, and then generate a report that we can present to management or present to auditors when they come to perform their functions. Okay, so let me just quickly speak to the policy compliance, the components rather for policy compliance using Qualys. So Qualys has, the components are, first of all, we need to look at the sensors. So Qualys use sensors for asset management to gain information about assets. So they use agents and then they use scanners. So in each of their subscription, for example, like the containers, like mobile agents, they usually have sensors for each of those portfolio that they offer. So those agents is what they use to gather data from the assets, and then you can then start using those policies or start using those sensors to do whatever thing you want to do. So for them, they offer the sensors in the sensor company. They offer agents, and then they have scanners. So for scanners, the scanners are of two types. They have virtual scanners, and then they have physical scanners. So the physical scanner is a physical appliance you have to purchase directly from Qualys, and then you can install it within your data center for scanning and things like that. So the agents are just simple or very mild application that you install on your assets to gather data. So for agents, you can actually install it on endpoint, for example, your servers, your operating systems, your servers, so to speak, running different operating system like your Linux or your Windows machines. Then you can install those agents on them, and then the agents will capture data and then send it to the cloud for central monitoring and processing of those data. So the Qualys recommendation is that you have both within your environment. And one of the best practices, or what I've observed, is that most organizations tend to use the virtual appliance, because all you just need to do is to deploy a virtual machine, provision a virtual environment, and then install the virtual appliance, and then you can then connect it to the Qualys guard via the internet. So using that means that you don't have to purchase the physical scanner. You can just have the virtual scanner in your environment, and then you're good to go in terms of doing what you actually want to do. Then, like I said, the agent will be installed on your endpoints, and then they can send their data to the cloud. Okay, so the next component is the policy space. So for policies, Qualys have over 20,000 policies in their library, which cut across different regulatory bodies that you can actually use to ensure that you're compliant within your organization. So there are different ways you can actually create policies. You can actually create a policy from scratch. So they provide you with the capability to be able to create a policy from scratch. And when it comes to creating policy from scratch, it actually requires you working with other teams, because a single person can just create a policy, especially when it has to do with implementing technologies and controls. You have to work with the team involved, or the policy you're trying to create, the teams that is required to manage that particular. So for example, you want to create a network, a policy that applies to networking devices. So you need to work with the networking team, to bring the policies and cause some specific controls, or also use some CIS controls, to implement to achieve the policy you're trying to create. So you can also create a policy from host. So from host means that you've actually applied the policy to a particular host, and then you can use that host as a guinea pig to implement policies across your organization, using the host more like a template, so to speak. Then you can also create policies from libraries, which is actually Qualys recommendation, that you create your policies from the libraries. So those libraries speak to different technologies, and then you can tweak those libraries to suit your particular environment. And then also another approach is to use XML, extendable markup language. So those are there are some specific policies that have been written with markup languages. Then you can just import them into Qualys, and then you'll be fine. Then also there's something they call mandates. So mandates are specific policies. For example, so the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's considered as a mandate, and the Qualys refers to them as mandates. So other uh, regulatory standards are referred to as mandates. So you can actually run a report on specific mandate that is tied to that specific policy, and then you can use that to and then you can use that mandate. You can create a report in that mandate and present it to the management as that. Then for controls, each of the policies definitely should have a control, because when you're running a compliance scan, that compliance scan will be scanned with the controls in mind. So if you don't have a control to your policy, then your policy creation is not actually complete. So in the control component, it applies to several technologies. So they have different technologies. They've created different controls for different technologies. So the controls that applies to Windows Server, for example, Microsoft controls that applies to different vendors, Cisco that applies to firewalls or different technology. So they prefer those controls. So they're huge amount of numbers of controls, and then you can also create your own controls. You can pick from a particular template, and then you can tweak it as your own internal control. So even if you're not really focusing your policies as you're not tying your policies to specific regulatory body, you want to create it internally, you can create a policy and then create your own controls, and then add it to that policy. So for controls, there are two types. The system defined control, which is SDC, and the user defined control, which is UDC. So the SDC are the ones that are embedded into the system. Those are the ones that are created by Qualys, so they are called system defined controls. And the one that you create yourself will be tagged as user defined controls. And lastly, we'll be looking at the reporting component. So for the reporting component, like I mentioned, so they have different templates as well for different type of report. And then for the mandates, like I spoke about, the specific template for each of those mandates, report for each of those mandates. So you can just go into the report and say you want to run a, let's say, a NIST, for example, a NIST mandate report, and then you can use that NIST mandate report template to generate the report that speaks to that particular mandate. So these are the four major components that Qualys tend to use when it comes to regulatory standard policy compliance. Okay, and so for our demo, I just want to give a pictorial view of how a demo would look like, and then before we dive into the demo proper. Okay, so Qualys, like I said, is an online subscription based solution. So which is why I have um, which is why I have it in the cloud here. Okay, so this is just to give a typical example of how an infrastructure would look like, and how the policy compliance will actually come into play. So we have our Qualys, which is in the cloud, which is actually in the external environment, and then ideally you should have a firewall, and that firewall, it's so here I'm using a virtual firewall, which is a demo, for example. And then you have your virtual switch where all of my internal devices are connected to. So I have my virtual scanner here, which is my virtual scanner is connected to my virtual switch. And then I have my endpoint. So this is my I have a Windows 10 machine, I have an Active Directory machine, I have a member server, I have a Linux machine, and one other machine. We'll get to see that when we get into the demo section. So what this A means, it means I installed agents on each of those machines. So I'm also going to take you through how to install agents on the machines, and then definitely will be fine. So before we go into the demo section, the reason why I took some time to explain is so that you can have a proper overview and understanding of what we want to do before we get into the demo section itself, so that you have a proper understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, and then the demo will actually make more sense rather than just jumping into the demo section and going around doing what needs to be done. All right, I'll see you in the demo section.